Morning, everyone. Good morning. I have to arise from my executive accommodation today. Anyway, welcome. Lovely to see you all. So this is the penultimate talk. Next week, I'll be dealing with the ending of the book. Today, Robert's dealing with God's two long speeches. So we're looking forward to that. So welcome to everyone who's with us on the live stream. We hope you'll also enjoy the session. So let's begin with prayer. Lord, we give you thanks for the times that we've been able to gather together around this amazing book, and for all that we have learned by studying it. And we thank you that we're able to study it together, which is almost always much nicer. And so we pray for Robert that you will guide him as he leads us into this climactic section of the book, which we've been waiting for so long. And so we lift ourselves to you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Well, that's good. All right. Good morning. Hello. Here we go, then. God's speeches. Climactic, as Tim said. Is Claire here? No. Well, unlike Claire last time, I'm not a distinguished academic, so I certainly haven't read as many commentaries as she has, and probably also as much as our previous speakers did. But from what I did read, I quickly discovered that I was able to understand relatively easily and connect with Carol Newsom's comments in a way that I found hard with some of the others. So in what follows, you will find less of commentator A said this and commentator B said that. I will be focusing on what Carol Newsom has to say, which in itself is probably quite challenging enough for most of us. Fortunately, judging from other speakers' comments in previous weeks, I am not alone in admiring her work. If you haven't done so already, some of her YouTube clips are well worth a visit. And I don't want you to get the wrong idea here. I'm not her agent. So, the divine speeches. I have always had a fairly straightforward view of the divine speeches. Job has a moan at God about his treatment and what he's been through, and God responds with, "Who do you think you are? And let me tell you a thing or two." Just to check that it was not just me who thought this, I googled divine speech commentaries and found much the same. So, actually, it was Tim who led me to Carol Newsom's commentary, and so I took a look at that and found that, in her view, things are not quite as simple as that. We'll start with chapter 38. Stella, if you could come and grab the mic and read us verses 1 to 11. Thank you.
Thank you. The Lord speaks. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. He said, "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy. Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness? When I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place? When I said, this far you may come and no further, here is where your proud waves halt.
Thank you. Newsom says that the key to understanding the divine speeches is how to interpret all the many images that appear in the text on the nature of the relationship between God and the symbols of the chaotic. Well, that was news to me. I can't say that symbols of the chaotic had been on my radar at all. In fact, Newsom's analysis is all about the tension between an ordered world and a chaotic world. Interestingly, neither of the words chaos or chaotic appear in the book of Job at all. Having said all of this, chapter 38 seems to be relatively straightforward. Words like boundary, path, way, and place are all structural and contribute to a sense of security of a well-ordered world. And these follow on from phrases which indicate architectural stability. For example, earth's foundation, footing set, who laid its cornerstone. Even when the forces that threaten order are introduced, the sea, night and its violence, the deep, death, they are described in terms of the limits imposed on them. For example, bars and doors, gates, the daily shaking out of the wicked. However, even here, things start to stray from what one finds written about creation elsewhere in the Bible. This occurs in how the sea is presented in, we've just heard, chapter 38, verses 8 to 11. In keeping with what's traditional, the sea is portrayed as violent and aggressive, bursting out and threatening to exceed its place until confined within the limits of doors and bars. However, there is a departure from traditional imagery in that the sea is not cast as God's opponent in battle, which so often it is, but instead represents God as the midwife who births the sea and wraps it in swaddling clothes of darkness and cloud. Here I love Newsom's description. In birth, a force that will not be denied breaks through containment and transgresses a boundary. Quite literally, the breaking through of the birth waters of the womb marks the onset of the process. Wrapping a baby in swaddling clothes serves to restrain its arms and legs from moving about, and so calm the child. Through this imagery, both the traditional aggressiveness of the sea and the restraints placed upon it are taken up. Here, the chaotic waters of the sea are represented not only as the object of divine limitation, but also of divine care. So far, so good? We okay? All right, in that case, we'll move on to chapter 39. Emma, please. Emma's going to read verse 1 to 8 and 13 to 18.
Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you watch when the doe bears her fawn? Do you count the months till they bear? Do you know the time they give birth? They crouch down and bring forth their young. Their labour pains are ended. Their young thrive and grow strong in the wilds. They leave and do not return. Who let the wild donkey go free? Who untied its ropes? I gave it the wasteland as its home, the salt flats as its habitat. It laughs at the commotion in the town. It does not hear a driver's shout. It ranges the hills for its pasture and searches for any green thing. And then down to verse 13. The wings of the ostrich flap joyfully, though they cannot compare with the wings and feathers of the stork. She lays her eggs on the ground and lets them warm in the sand, unmindful that a foot may crush them, that some wild animal may trample them. She treats her young harshly as if they were not hers. She cares not that her labour was in vain, for God did not endow her with wisdom or give her a share of good sense. Yet when she spreads her feathers to run, she laughs at horse and rider.
Thank you, Emma.
Please remember that you can ask questions or make comments at any time. I'm sure Robert won't mind.
Not at all. So, the different way of looking at things that we've seen in the description of the sea carries on with several wild animals. Firstly, there's the wild donkey and the wild ox. The wild donkey is often a symbol for a rule or lawbreaker in God's. So God's care for the wild donkey is presented as a reversal of human values. Its habitat, the desolate salt flats and the near barren mountains, is not only the opposite of human cultivated land, but also serves as an image of punishment for people. By contrast, the city, as a place of noise and oppression, a place of bondage from which God sets the wild donkey free. Similarly, the wild ox is represented in such a way as to provide a contrast with domestication. We're talking animals here, but Newsom says that what defines domestication is the exchange of food for service. The reason you own a cow is to provide you with milk or to plough your fields. However, this arrangement is crazy when talking about the wild ox. Similarly, although mountain goats and wild deer are not fearsome or traditionally despised animals, they provide a contrast to domesticated sheep and goats. The essential knowledge about breeding that a shepherd needs to increase his flocks can't be known for mountain goats and wild deer. So instead of forming ever-increasing herds, as useful domesticated animals do, their young disperse. Okay, we'll move on to the ostrich. In chapter 30:29, Job talks about the ostrich as his companion, maybe to highlight his isolation from human society. And I quote from 30:29, "I've become the brother of jackals, a companion of owls." And perhaps Job talks about it also to suggest his mournfulness. And 30:31 says, "My lyre is tuned to mourning and my pipe to the sound of wailing." The ostrich's cry, let me say, was associated with mourning. That's Micah 1:8. Here, however, and as a contrast, the ostrich represents the absence of wisdom and understanding, terms closely associated with the rationality of creation, which humans seek to know in order to live securely. What the ostrich possesses, I'm no expert on the ostrich, but apparently this is the case, is completely over-the-top joy. The term by which it is named in Job 39:13 is cries of joy. Similarly, the term which describes the movements of its wings literally means to be glad. The ostrich laughs at the pursuit of horse and rider. This is particularly significant since it relates to a hunt where, on the one hand, there is culture and on the other hand, nature. Again, this is a portrayal of human order on the one hand and chaos on the other. Although the divine speeches never draw an explicit conclusion, God's celebration of the ostrich's evasion seems uncomfortably to place God in considerable sympathy with the chaotic. Barry, it's taken a while. Oh yeah, you're on mic.
It's a very simple question. What are ostriches doing in the Middle East? They're not from that area.
Oh, goodness me. I've got David Attenborough's number, if...
It's just that we're not used to ostriches being other than in the southern Africa and the south of the Sahara.
But in those days, they may have been ostriches, surely.
I'm sure there would, but it's just an amazing that it's a very common symbol, and it's just not on now. It's just very amazing.
Well, it's interesting that also, I mean, I mentioned jackal there, and I kind of wondered when you know, hey, is ostrich and jackal the same thing, or are they different things? I'm not sure.
Well, God's over all, isn't he?
Are there deserts in Edom?
I'm sure there are. Yes. Yes.
This sounds like where we are, ostriches and jackals and things. Yeah.
Job the Edomite. Yeah.
Job the Edomite. Hello, Paul.
Be the mic man, so just to let you off there, Tim, unless you want to.
Oh, right, okay. The same effect as the ostrich, achieved by different means, occurs in the description of the warhorse. What is celebrated in the warhorse is its total enjoyment of battle, something which has nothing to do with domestication, but comes from its own incomprehensible nature. Like the ostrich, the horse, and this is chapter 39, 22a, the horse laughs at fear, afraid of nothing. It is not a form of courage, the overcoming of fear such as humans know, but something more elemental. By describing the horse as snorting when he scents battle from afar, the writer suggests that the desire for battle, with all its violence, noise, and confusion, is a kind of lust, as a stallion would scent from a mare in heat. However, these verses are not just about horses. The initial description of the horse is composed largely in terms elsewhere used to describe the appearance of God in glory. Might, that's chapter 12, 13, thunder, 49, majesty, 37:22, and terror, 9:34. Again, the writer is being extremely subtle in stating nothing, but conveying lots. So, the final verses of this chapter begin with a traditional image of mystery and beauty, the flight of the hawk. The writer then shifts from the imagery of the vast distances of the hawk's flight to the vertical height of the vulture's nest, high on a rocky crag. The nest suggests the bird's provision for food for its nestlings. For example, the raven's young who cry to God for food. However, the writer delays that description, commenting first on the bird's extraordinary power of sight. The last verse follows the bird's line of vision in its flight to the corpses of those killed in battle. Here is the food that God provides, the blood that the young will drink. With this horrible image of human beings as food for young vultures, God concludes the speech. Okay? move on to chapter 40 and 41. Eric, if you could come and read 40, and it's a relatively small chapter, so we'll hear it all.
Well, if I can do without it, can you? I need it to. Oh, right. The Lord said to Job, "Will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him." Then Job answered the Lord, "I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more." Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. "Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? Do you have an arm like God's? And can your voice thunder like his? Then adorn yourself with glory and splendor, and clothe yourself as honor and majesty. Unleash the fury of your wrath. Look at every proud man and bring him low. Look at every proud man and humble him. Crush the wicked where they stand. Bury them all in the dust together. Shroud their faces in the grave. Then I myself will admit to you that your own right hand can save you. Look at the behemoth, which I made along with you, and which feeds on grass like an ox. What strength he has in his loins, what power in the muscles of his belly. His tail sways like a cedar, the sinews of his thighs are close-knit. His bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs like rods of iron. He ranks first among the works of God, yet his maker can approach him with his sword. The hills bring him their produce, and all the wild animals play nearby. Under the lotus plant he lies, hidden among the reeds in the marsh. The lotuses conceal him in their shadow. The poplars by the stream surround him. When the river rages, he is not alarmed. He is secure, though the Jordan should surge against his mouth. Can anyone capture him by the eyes, or trap him and pierce his nose?
Thank you. And actually, we're going to do 40 and 41 together. So, Margie, if you could read 41, 12 to 34, please.
I will not fail to speak of Leviathan's limbs, his strength and his graceful form. Who can strip off his outer coat? Who can penetrate his double coat of armor? Who dares open the doors of his mouth, ringed about with fearsome teeth? His back has rows of shields, tightly sealed together. Each is so close to the next that no air can pass between. They are joined fast to one another. They cling together and cannot be parted. His snorting throws out flashes of light. His eyes are like the rays of dawn. Flames stream from his mouth. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke pours from his nostrils as from a boiling pot over burning reeds. His breath sets coals ablaze, and flames dart from his mouth. Strength resides in his neck. Dismay goes before him. The folds of his flesh are tightly joined. They are firm and immovable. His chest is hard as rock, hard as a lower millstone. When he rises up, the mighty are terrified. They retreat before his thrashing. The sword that reaches him has no effect, nor does the spear or the dart or the javelin. Iron he treats like straw, and bronze like rotten wood. Arrows do not make him flee. Sling stones are like chaff to him. A club seems to him but a piece of straw. He laughs at the rattling of the lance. His undersides are jagged potsherds, leaving a trail in the mud like a threshing sledge. He makes the depths churn like a boiling cauldron and stirs up the sea like a pot of ointment. He leaves a glistening wake behind him. One would think the deep had white hair. Nothing on earth is his equal, a creature without fear. He looks down on all that are haughty. He is king over all that are proud.
Thank you both. So, we're moving. Beg your pardon.
Throughout that passage, it was referred to as his. In my Bible, the translation is it, and I wondered why.
In this other Bible we have, which is NIV, it is he, him, his. So then I got worried about that, and I looked it up online, and some say he, and some say it. And I decided to go with he.
I can't add to that.
Well, the Hebrew is the third person masculine. Okay, which could be translated he or it. So you can take your pick. Okay.
Thank you. So the second divine speech actually says nothing that we haven't heard before, really. Since Job seems to be hard of hearing, God simply repeats the message louder and more slowly. God asks Job if his power is as great as God's, and if he can therefore bring low the proud. If he can, then God will praise Job's great victory. I give him a big pat on the back. However, as the text of the speech makes clear, Behemoth and Leviathan serve as examples of proud creatures whom neither Job nor any other human could possibly bring low. One can see why many commentators are inclined to read the speeches simply as affirming what Job can't do, God can do. This results in the comforting and traditional view of the world as one organized and defended by a God who continually defeats the forces of chaos, even if he does not guarantee strict legal justice. It would allow Job to resume his proper place within that well-regulated world. But things are not so simple. The discussion concerning pride in this speech, as it describes God's relationship with the great creatures, and in doing so God's governance, heads off in a different direction. The text stresses that Behemoth is a creature of God, one described with awe for his size and strength. The account of Behemoth's physical appearance is framed by two references to his creation. Whom I made along with you is the first, and he is the first chief acts of God is the second. The first comment associates Job and Behemoth as fellow creatures. The second gives Behemoth a status exceeding Job's. I'll repeat it. He is the first chief acts of God. Like Behemoth, Leviathan will also be described as a creature, quote, without equal, a king over all the proud. The verses about Leviathan are the pinnacle of what God has to say to Job. There is a considerable level of identification between God and Leviathan. God represents himself as being in the image of Leviathan, only more so. What Job has heard in the divine speeches is a devastating undermining of his deeply held view of the moral and ethical relationship between himself, the world, and God. It is a profound loss of what he has previously held as his fundamental beliefs. The recognition that his reality, a recognition that his reality may not be God's reality.
Can I just make a comment?
Yeah.
I think this section, this section particularly calls to mind a comment by the literary critic George Steiner, who wonders, and I quote him, whether the enormousness of the original Hebrew was possible for any human being to have thought up. A volcanic god has erupted into inhuman poetry, he says. I think this section particularly is such powerful poetry as to remind me of that comment.
So we've kind of walked our way through chapters 38, 39, 40 and 41. And in Newsom's commentary, she now goes on to discuss something called the Tragic Sublime, which was a sort of new phrase to me, but really means exhibiting greatness in the midst of tragedy. And, link it to Job. She starts, we're left with the question, what is one to make of the divine speeches? There are many things that are obvious in them, including the power of God and the comparative impotence of humans, or the universe as a place of structure and order, within which the chaotic forces have their rightful place. But there may be a deeper interpretation of what's being said. How does God view the things that have been described? What does God delight in and nurture in the world? With what creatures does God identify? From the striking portrayal of the sea as swaddling infant to the celebration of the wilderness, home to those creatures who mock and spurn human control, to the enthusiastic description of Leviathan, the feeling that God's identification with the chaotic is as strong as with the symbols of order. At the end of the divine speeches, three characters dominate the scene: Job, God, and Leviathan. What is required is to work out the relationships between them. Job laid claim to a strong and sure bond between himself and God. Knowing himself as the embodiment and upholder of moral values, he identifies with God. However, God also establishes another fundamental relationship, this time with Leviathan. In this relationship, the non-moral and non-rational aspects of deity come to the fore. This highlights aspects of God with which we are far less comfortable and familiar. If one looks at the divine speeches like this, then Job and Leviathan emerge as paired opposites, both perfected embodiments of aspects of the divine, but neither representing its full image. Significantly, it is not Leviathan's pride that is brought low, but Job's. But what is it that defines Job's pride? His pride, a characteristic of human pride, is, another quote, his blessed rage for order. Newsom introduces this phrase, and we'll take a look at it, where it comes from in a minute. As Job's speech in chapters 29 to 31 illustrated, the human imperative is the creation of orders of value and meaning with which to make sense of experience. Being incomplete beings who cannot completely rely on instinct for the structuring of our own little world, we do the best we can to build what is lacking. And we typically insist that our moral orders are not simply made up, but are grounded in the structures of reality itself. Consequently, it is very difficult for us to acknowledge the reality of that which resists rational organization into structures of meaning and human purpose. The human passion for moral order is also a passion for security, for seeking out a way of living that can keep the world the way we want it and our families safe and secure. It is almost an obsession, and in it we deny the tragic in existence. This is what underlies the baffled astonishment for the one who weeps for the unfortunate, grieves for the needy, and yet finds evil and darkness instead of goodness and light. Leviathan brings to the fore the self-deception of the human rage for order. But what makes for tragedy is not simply the nature of the universe in itself, but rather the inevitable clash of the two necessities. It is not possible that human beings could cease to be makers of moral worlds that shelter and protect value relations and personal relations. Neither is it possible that the intrinsic and unmasterable violence of existence, its indifference to human values, will cease to, and we've heard this quote, to make the depths boil like a cauldron, with all the pain, loss, and shock that this implies. As a postscript to this section, I wanted to add the following comments by Newsom. Newsom says that almost all commentators draw attention to the ambiguity and obliqueness of the divine speeches. Pages upon pages have poured from critics who puzzle over how and in what way the divine speeches serve as a reply to Job. Newsom suggests that the speech by Job and the speech by God stand over each other somewhat like the facing panels of a diptych, that's two hinged leaves, i.e. contrasting but linked utterances. The divine speeches are structured to take Job from places of secure boundaries to places where boundaries are put at risk. Although they invoke many of the images of creation accounts, they run counter to the narrative sequence of creation myths in which the creator God defeats the chaos monster and then proceeds to create a secure and stable world in which culture can flourish. Here the sequence enacts something of an uncreation as the divine speeches lead Job progressively closer to a sustained and intimate counter with the primary symbol of the chaotic. Oh.
Yes, Stella. Hang on, Stella, whoops. I think that it's worth pausing, and perhaps you might like to think a bit, and I'm sure Stella will do this, about this whole thing about order, our rage for order and disorder in the world. Stella, you can.
Well, this is probably going to sound a terribly dim question, but at the end of all of this, does poor old Job pass the test? Because he was tested, wasn't he? That at the beginning, wasn't that what it was all about? That God was testing him, that he wouldn't say anything detrimental about the Lord. So at the end of all of this, Job, has he passed that test?
Good question. So, what do people think?
I'm really not sure. Which is why I asked the question.
Well, I think it's a very acute question, and perhaps we'll have to save the answer to next week when we deal with Job's responses, to God. But this thing about blessed rage water, Barry.
This is a very Old Testament incarnation picture of the world. We are used to a picture of a loving, giving God who sends his Son into the world to redeem the world. Where are we then able to, in a sense, in the presence of Jesus, interpret some of this picture that we've got of a God who seems to be dependent on power and might and thunder and calming storms, as a picture versus Jesus, who tells us that love is what matters?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, God is love.
Roger, yes.
Doesn't feature in this.
I just wanted to say in response to that, Jesus did also say, I have not come to bring peace, but a sword.
Yes, that's worth picking up. I have something to say about that. Yeah.
My comment is entirely naive, but I'm sure Jesus read these words, and I bet he sat and shook his head. That's not how my Father is.
The stuff about chaos is very interesting in two ways, really. One, to me anyhow, one, the division between the natural world, the world of scientific laws, and the human, the human world, where we're responsible, and where there is, certainly in the human world, you can say there is chaos. We see it in Ukraine. But also in the natural world. I mean, although there are laws and so on, when will this planetary system come to an end? We don't know. And although he doesn't speak in those terms, the issues he raises are still valid today, aren't they? Even though not necessarily, not necessarily couch them in terms of God. They exist in a, you know, even if you look at the world in a non-religious way, those issues arise.
I mean, to me, Ukraine, if you know, one can't get away from it, of course, it screams chaos, but it also screams, in many situations, in some of the situations, the love of God, to pick up Barry's point. I mean, the way that the world has responded, the way that Poland's responded, the way that individuals have responded, the way that governments have responded. You know, I mean, that is God's love at work for the Ukrainian people in a time of desperation. But you know, it doesn't get rid of the chaos.
Alison.
Hi. I know it's tempting to just say, oh, well, that's not God now and not God as revealed by Jesus. But I think that may just be us avoiding the issue. Because I think there is a real tendency for us to try and put God in a box and domesticate him and gentle Jesus, meek and mild and all that. And, you know, there are elements of our world that do demonstrate this. You know, if you see the raging sea, the storms, tsunamis, all those sort of natural, amazing things, even just being in the mountains where I was recently. It's just, humans almost seem like an afterthought. And when I think about things like quantum theory and quantum physics, I don't understand it at all, and it is sort of chaos to me. My son works with quantum computers. Now, they don't, in my understanding, kind of exist, and yet they do lots of calculations. I can't get my head around that. What I'm trying to say is, I think, for me, when our group looked at this previously, this session was quite revelatory stroke traumatizing to me. It kind of made me have to rethink who God is. He still is Jesus and the one who loves us and died for us. But he's also the one that creates and loves Leviathan. And we probably need to think about that.
So I think there are really two. God has created us with this desire for order, this need for order, and that's part of life. We can't really survive without some order in our lives, can we? And yet at the same time, we know very well that chaos erupts all around us in a huge variety of ways all the time. And I would argue that the entire Bible, the whole business of living by faith, puts us into the question. It's not an answer, it's a question about how we manage this difference between order and chaos, both of which are subsumed in the nature of God. So that's why in the Bible we have the image of God as the maker of absolute order in Genesis chapter 1. Everything is very good. There's nothing bad at all. And then we have the God of Job, 38 to 41, who makes and loves the chaotic. And the two are not in contradiction. They're two dimensions of the being of God, which we see also in the reality of the world around us. And we have to, in faith, negotiate those two extremes. But they're both there, and they're both present in God. And I would disagree with the idea that Jesus is gentle, Jesus meek and mild. He was crucified precisely because he erupted into society in a destructive way, in a way that people felt was destructive to the order that they wanted. And that's why they killed him. They didn't kill him because he was gentle, Jesus, meek and mild. They killed him because they saw him as destroying the peaceful, orderly religion that they followed. And the danger of institutionalized religion is always that we move towards the institutionalization of God and of faith. And therefore, it becomes a safe, cozy area, which it's not. So if you think of people, just to take people who have really taken Jesus at his word in a way that most of us did, like, say, St. Francis, who read that bit about Jesus saying, don't take anything for yourself, no possessions, nothing, just go around and live by begging. He took that literally and created a huge movement of beggars, which was in danger of sinking the entire Italian economy at the time because it was so successful. And it had to change. It had to become institutionalized because the economy could not cope with the disorder which St. Francis's obedience to God had created. It's a very, and I believe that we live in that question in which we seek for order, and that's good, and yet at the same time, if order becomes an end in itself, then it becomes something other than God, and it just becomes cozy. And that's not ever who God is. Jan, and then Barry.
If we're thinking about our fear of so-called chaos, I mean, it's really, and related to what you've just said, Tim, it's when something happens that we can't control. But therefore, I would say, because God can control everything, he doesn't view chaos in the same way that we do. It's his, he's got nothing to fear from it. But we are very fearful of anything that's arising that we can't control, whether it's a man-made sort of institution or whether it's the natural world. And isn't it that we just have this fear of not knowing how to cope with something which is out of our control, and therefore we call it chaos?
Thanks, Jan. Yes, absolutely. Barry.
God created us as social animals. Our real development and our evolutionary development is as social animals. The only reason why we are here, being able to read, write, talk, is because we have worked together as social groups. And for that to happen, we need order. So it's almost antithetical that, here we are, only being able to discuss this because of social order, yet we are saying that actually, we shouldn't necessarily be in that, relying on that pattern. Yet we are. The only reason we're here is we've relied on that pattern to help us develop to where we are. If we didn't rely on it, we would still be hanging around in trees.
Yes, that's the paradox of human existence, is that we need order, and yet at the same time order can become, if it becomes an end in itself, then it becomes something antithetical to God. That's the paradox. Bridget. Stella first, okay,
Sorry.
Stella, and then Bridget.
If God is a God of chaos, is that why he never intervenes in wars? Because he delights in chaos?
Oh, good question. Okay.
Richard, sorry, Richard.
Bridget over there.
Well, Bridget.
There's no. I wouldn't say that God delights in every form of chaos, which kills, particularly chaos which kills people. I wouldn't think that God delights in that, and therefore God says, "Okay, we'll get on with it, chaps. It's fun." I don't think it's that kind of chaos that God would associate himself with. Bridget.
Yeah, I was having a sort of quiet time this morning, and I finished the quiet time asking the question, why do we have emotions? And I was thinking, this was connecting with this, because I was feeling that, my life would be so ordered and orderly if there were no emotions in me. And that the emotions throw me into chaos, and this fight between order in me and chaos. Sorry.
No, that's right, yes. But if you didn't have them, then you would be a robot, wouldn't you? Much less interesting person than you are. Yes.
Can I just pop a question in myself, Robert? Just following Stella's point, did Joe pass the test? We've got right in the last chapter, where God gives back everything to Job and doubles it, assuming that the point is, yeah, okay, Job, well done, you've done it. Doesn't this undermine, really, what you've been talking about now, about the nature of God being, this chaotic element?
Well, we'll get into that next week. That will be central to next week. We'll have to think about the ending. What kind of ending is this ending? That will be what we look at next week. So let's leave that question for next week, okay? Yes, Nico.
Yeah, I've got a question from online, actually from Florida, and this is Malcolm Bailey, and he's asking...
Hello, Malcolm.
Yeah, he didn't want to miss out. So he's asking, where did the universal understanding of natural justice come from? Where did the universal understanding of natural justice come from? Nice and easy question.
Do you want to answer that, Robert?
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I would say that it comes from God, or because if we believe that God is just, then and is the creator, then God, everything about justice comes ultimately from God. Have you noticed that God, as God presents himself in these chapters in Job, there is absolutely nothing which relates to the central way in which both the Old Testament and the New Testament understand God to be a God of reward and punishment, or punishment and reward. So if you are good, then goodness is justice and will lead to reward, but if you are bad, then you will be punished. Now that's the central theme of the theology in both the Old Testament and possibly in Paul as well, who is the dominant writer of the New Testament, that justice means reward and punishment, punishment and reward, and that there is no escape from that transactional economy, is that if you're good, you will get a reward. If you're bad, you will be punished. So that's a central theme in the whole presentation of God in both Testaments, but in this picture that God gives of himself, there's no sense of that at all. It's because it's rooted entirely in a creation theology, not in a retributive justice theology. Barry. Paul?
On that score, the retributive justice theology image is very much about social order. And in a sense, social orders, the hierarchies, the controlling orders of the world need that to justify themselves to the people they dominate.
Yes, they do. But it's not the only concept of justice that there is. Restorative justice is a different thing from retributive justice, and a lot of people struggle with the whole notion of retributive justice through God, that God is a retributive God. It's a really controversial area of theology, yeah.
Can I just make a point following Malcolm's question, that isn't this relate to one of the classical arguments for the existence of God, the moral argument, that the world seems to work better on a moral basis? Isn't that something that we've generally understood?
Yes, I think it gets back to Barry's point. You can't do without that. That's the basis of the blessed rage for order, is that morality has to be part of that. And if we forsake morality, then where are we? I mean, that's been really part of the underlying question around Johnson's behavior, isn't it? If you have a leader who's immoral, then where are you? So there we are. Yeah, so we do need a sense of morality, yeah. Okay, Robert, do you want to...
Thank you. Yeah, thank you all. Thanks very much for that discussion. I'm pleased we had that discussion before I sort of do the first part of the wrap, actually. And the first part of the wrap is, I mean, I'd written down, I did it like a year ago when we first did this study, and I sort of worked on it a little bit for this one. So this is kind of take two, and it's a sort of personal reflection on the passages that the chapters we've read and the discussion that we've had. I have never really thought about human beings as a species having a blessed rage for order. But I guess it's true. We all know how we like things to be. We get very uncomfortable if they're not. And we all want to be in control to a greater or lesser extent. So a proposition that questions or challenges that this is God's design is disquieting. Having a blessed rage for order may be considered a rather selfish attribute. It says, I want things done my way, not your way. This is not love your neighbour behaviour in New Testament speak. God's affinity for Leviathan, on the other hand, indicates that there is another way and God is wholly at one with it. So maybe we need to consider what this means for us as individuals, the way we live our lives and the way we interact with other people. That was my personal reflection, for what it's worth. And I have to say, I mean, since, I've been studying this for a year now with the group, it has made me far more aware of, when I sit in a one-to-one discussion, a group discussion, any other discussion, it's absolutely staggering how often, goodness me, I'm trying to impose my way on this other person who views things differently. And I'm kind of coming from the position that I think I'm right and they're wrong. And, to unwind that I found it's starting to be a little bit helpful anyway. I said I'd finish with a couple of things, and Nico's got the slides. Blessed rage for order first. So, where does this phrase, blessed rage for order, come from? It's not in the Bible, it's not in Job, but Newsom uses it and a number of times in her commentary on these 4 chapters. And actually, I think I've got this right. It took quite a bit of Googling and a bit of help from Tim and so on. I think I've got this right. Blessed Rage for Order, it first appeared an American poet, lawyer, and insurance executive called Wallace Stevens. You can obviously Google him and Wikipedia him. 1879 to 1955. And he wrote a wonderful poem called Blessed Rage for Order, and we'll look at a couple of stanzas in a minute. So that's where I think it came from originally, and then a chap called David Tracy picked it up in a book he wrote, which he called Blessed Rage for Order. And I mean, he was looking at an examination of the cultural context in which theological pluralism emerged. That's a bit of a mouthful, but that's what he was doing, and it's an unbelievably heavy book, but if you want to give it a go, give it a go. And then finally, then Carol Newsom picks it up, and she picks it up and uses it in her commentary, which is this book, and I recommend this book to you all, the book of Job, A Contest of Moral Imaginations, which I know, we've covered already. So that's that. And if you put in the next slide, I think, is that? Yeah, so the Blessed Rage for Order, and when Tim sends out, what I've gone through, he'll send you a copy of the poem as well, which I've downloaded from the internet, of course. And it's like a 7-stanza poem, and I'm just going to read you the last couple of stanzas here, I think. Let's do it. I'll do it from there. Raymond Fernandez, tell me if you know why, when the singing ended and we turned towards the town, tell why the glassy lights, the lights in the fishing boats at anchor there, as the night descended, tilting in the air, mastered the night and portioned out the sea, fixing emblazoned zones and fiery poles, arranging, deepening, enchanting night. O blessed rage for order, pale Ramon, the maker's rage to order words of the sea, words of the fragrant portals dimly starred, and of ourselves and of our origins, in ghostlier demarcations, keener sounds. Oh, well, there we are. You can get an idea of the poetry of it, but yeah, read all 7 stanzas when you get it. So that's, yeah, where the words blessed rage for order came from. And then finally, I thought one of the things came out from the first time we did this was a paper that Archbishop Rowan Williams had, he did it in lecture form to the Diocese of Guildford in 2010. And there's a passage from, and we'll also send you that paper because it's well worth reading. And there's a passage in that paper which I thought I wanted to close on. We've touched on it in all the discussion we've had. So if you could put that up. The paper was called The Finality of Christ in a Pluralist World. The more you believe that God really is God, the less you believe that God needs to be protected by human beings from the consequences of his own recklessness. We Christians are sometimes very reluctant, sometimes very reluctant sometimes, and he did say that, to leave God to sort things out. We often have a vague feeling that God hasn't read the proper books. And sometimes we feel rather protective towards him and make sure that he knows the right policy. I think he sums up a lot of what we've been talking about quite well.
That is a brilliant essay. Thank you, Robert, for concluding in that way. Yes. Any further questions? I should say that we do have in the parish a couple of copies of Carol Newsom's book. So if anyone wants to borrow one and read the book, you are welcome to do so. It's one of the great theological books written quite recently, I think. Any further questions for Robert? Yes, Barry.
After God's reply, do you think Job is any wiser?
Well, we'll have to assess that, I think, next week. That deals with the ending. What is the ending all about? Which we'll have a look at next week. It's not as simple, to repeat Robert, it's not as simple as it seems. Okay, well, Robert, the extreme modesty of Robert's beginning, I think, was belied by the depth and acuteness of his presentation. So thank you so much, Robert, for dealing so wonderfully, for dealing so wonderfully with this incredibly rich section of this incredibly rich and thought-provoking book. So with that, next week we're going into the ending of the book, the Job's 2 responses to God's speeches, and then the conclusion, the storyteller's conclusion to the book. So we'll be dealing with the little bit of chapter 40, where Job responds, verses 1 to 5, and then his second response in chapter 42, verses 1 to 6, and then with the wrap-up by the narrator in chapter 42, verses 7 to 17. So a relatively small group of texts, but heavy with questions, I can promise you. So thank you, Robert, again, and thank you all for your participation. Thank you to everyone who has been with us online. And next week is our final sessions. So thank you for coming. Goodbye then.
Well, that's Claire's, actually. Yes. So she lent it to me just the last week or so. Oh, gosh, he certainly does.
I read he is a very interesting writer.
Yeah. Yes, and I mean, clearly he's, considered it and, been this way and that on it and so on. As one